So, Final Fantasy I, Square's last-ditch attempt at making a hit, was a success, selling 520,000 units in Japan. With a working formula finally under their belt, it was only natural that a sequel would follow, and that sequel, released exactly 364 days after the first game, was 1988's Final Fantasy II for the Famicom. There was a slight hurdle regarding where to take the sequel though. Since it had been designed to be the potential last game that Square produced, Final Fantasy I had a completely self-contained storyline. So instead of trying to continue from that game, Final Fantasy II is a brand new original story with new characters set in a completely different world, with no connection to the first game whatsoever. This is a tradition that would continue throughout the whole series. Every mainline game is a self-contained story which doesn't require context from any other games. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy II would not be released outside of Japan initially. There were plans to translate it for Western audiences, which did get as far as a beta localization and even advertised it in a handful of areas, but this version, entitled Dark Shadow over Palakia, would be scrapped. The reason for this was that by 1991 the Super Nintendo had already been released, making Final Fantasy II a game for the previous gen console, meaning it likely wouldn't see enough success to make a localization feasible. Instead, Square decided to localize their new Super Nintendo game, Final Fantasy IV, which they renamed as Final Fantasy II in Western markets to avoid confusion. Because absolutely none of what I just said is confusing. As a result, Final Fantasy II was only accessible to Japanese players for well over a decade, and it wasn't until its 16-bit remake in the Final Fantasy Origins collection for the PlayStation 1, 15 years after its initial release, that the Western market was finally able to get its hands on this title. In the years since, Final Fantasy II has had about as many remakes as Final Fantasy I, the major versions being the Origins version in 2003, Dawn of Souls version on Game Boy Advance in 2004, the PSP remake based on Dawn of Souls in 2008, and most recently the Pixel remaster for mobile phones and PC in 2021, each improving the graphics, making gameplay tweaks, and some adding in optional content and even a sequel story campaign. For this video though, I'll be focusing on the original Famicom version, or a fan translation of it since I can't read Japanese. What do you know, it even features coding from Yoshi. My reason for this is the same as the Final Fantasy I video. I want to see what it was like in its original form. Now, Final Fantasy II was a game I initially skipped over during my first run-through of the series, since I chose to start with 4 and continue from there. I would later go back and give the Game Boy Advance version a shot, but I dropped it about halfway through. I think I got caught up in college assignments and had to drop it for a bit, and then just never went back to it. I gave it another go about a year later though, and this time I actually managed to finish it. Unfortunately, my overall opinion was that it was by far the most tedious Final Fantasy game I had played up to that point, and coming back to it for this video, I definitely wasn't wrong. Now this video is going to contain spoilers for the game, so if you want to go in blind, I'd recommend you click off this video in 3, 2, 1, beaver. If not, then get ready, because today I'm talking in depth about Final Fantasy II. The Emperor Matthias of the Kingdom of Polymecia has summoned an army of demons from the fires of hell itself, which he is using to conquer the world one kingdom at a time. The most recent victim to the army of monsters is the Kingdom of Fynn, which has been burnt to the ground and most of its inhabitants slaughtered. The game opens with 4 young teenagers fleeing for their lives, the teens in question being the silver-haired protagonist Firion, skilled archer Maria, trusty swordsman Leon, and axe-wielding giant Guy. Truly majestic. Final Fantasy II does allow you to rename everyone though, and they even increased the character limit from 4 to 6. I asked my best friend to name them this time around, so instead of Firion, Maria and Leon, we've got Hunter, Violet and Rook. Guy is remaining Guy though, because we can't be improving on perfection now, can we? The 4 teens manage to escape the massacre of Fynn, but it isn't long before the army catches up with them. Not to worry though, just a harmless first battle, I'm sure it'll be
fatality.
Well, that went well. After being left for dead by the guards, Firion, Maria and Guy wake up to find they've been rescued by a group of rebels, led by Princess Hilda of Fynn, who narrowly escaped the invasion along with her father, the King of Fynn, but he, unfortunately, is suffering from an arrow in his back. With her home and families gone and Leon strangely nowhere in sight, the trio request to join the rebels in the fight against the Empire. Hilda, however, refuses, feeling that they are too young and inexperienced, and considering how the Emperor's troops almost killed us, she does have a point. Still, you can't keep a good rebel down, so Firion, Maria and Guy decide to return to Fynn on their own in search of Leon, seeing as he's nowhere to be found. They don't find Leon, but they do find Hilda's fiancé, Prince Scott of Kashuan. Scott is mortally wounded from his fight with the Empire, but informs us that Fynn was betrayed by one of its own nobles, Borgin, who is now working as one of the Emperor's generals. He also asks that the trio return his engagement ring to Hilda before dying. After returning to her and proving their courage, Hilda agrees to let the trio join the rebels, with their first mission being to obtain mithril ore from the town of Salamand. Though seeing as it's their first mission, she sends the rebels' white mage Minwu to give them a hand. With Minwu's help, the trio successfully obtain the mithril ore, allowing the rebel smiths to create better weapons and armour. But along the way, they hear that the Emperor has a mysterious new general known as the Dark Knight. Sadly, there are bigger things to worry about as the rebels have received info that the Emperor is constructing a warship, which, if completed, will allow him to wipe the rebels out. The four are sent to stop the warship's construction, but just as they arrive, they encounter the Dark Knight and Borgin, who laugh in their faces before setting off in the finished warship, the heroes having failed to do anything. The team returns to the rebel base to find it's been heavily bombed by the warship, or at least that's what the game tells you. Everything seems perfectly intact to me, but the king's condition has worsened, leading Minwu to leave the party in order to tend the king's wounds. The trio is left wondering what the hell to do about the warship, until the rebels' airship expert, a man named Sid, informs them of a magical flame known as the Flame Star, which, if thrown into the warship's engine, will cause it to blow sky high. Unfortunately, before dying, Scott sealed the Flame Star away in Cashwind Castle, with the only thing able to break the seal being the goddess Belle. And besides Scott, who's kind of dead now, the only person who knows the Belle's whereabouts is Scott's younger brother Gordon, who has gone missing since the warship attacked. Fortunately, it turns out that there actually is someone else who knows how to get to it, that being a rebel spy named Joseph, a bald man who punches monsters with his bare hands and comes pre-equipped with garlic for some reason. Does Joseph have sanguivorophobia? Joseph leads the trio to the snow cave where the Belle is located, and can I just say that I love the effect of tobogganing over the ice. Looks so beautiful. But just as they retrieve the Belle, the team is ambushed by the traitorous General Borgin himself. Fortunately, they manage to kill him in a single hit, but before they can escape, Borgin says,
"Okie dokie, now we go to the advanced level. Watch out for falling rocks." Scary.
Holy Christ, Joseph! We've only had him for a single dungeon, and yet here he is getting crushed to death by a boulder! Good lord! Anyway. Well, now that they have the goddess Belle, the trio head off to Cashwind Castle, where they obtain the Sunflame, but also unexpectedly meet Scott's younger brother Gordon, who, as it turns out, also wants to use it to blow up the warship, so the four team up to track it down. But just as they set off, Princess Hilda's airship flies past before being swallowed up by the warship. Apparently, Hilda felt guilty about sending us off in quest continuously, so she decided to come and meet us, only to be kidnapped along the way. Nice job, Hilda, stay off the booze in future. Doesn't matter too much though, as the team manages to sneak on board while it refuels. And by sneak on, I mean they give the guard a permission slip and are let on to do as they please. Very well trained soldiers in this empire, I see. But just as the team throws the Sunflame into the engine, the Dark Knight reappears, and his voice sounds extremely familiar according to Maria. I wonder who it could possibly be. No time to worry about that though, as the team successfully blows the airship up, escaping with Hilda and Sid in the nick of time. Mission accomplished. Sadly, they can't celebrate, for the King of Fynn is now beyond saving. The king asks that Gordon take his place as commander of the rebels, and asks Minwu to begin searching for the legendary spell, Ultima, which will surely help turn the tide of the war. Finally, he orders Fury, Maria and Guy to head to Deist, home of the legendary Dragoons, and ask for their assistance. With those final commands, the King of Fynn finally dies. The trio head off to Deist, encountering this pirate girl called Layla along the way, who orders her crew to kill you and then joins you after you defeat her men. Classic stuff, but soon enough the team arrives at Deist, only to find that the Dragoons are all dead. Turns out the Emperor poisoned the water supply a good while ago, leaving only a single dragon, who asks you to place its egg into a special spring before dying itself. With nothing to show for their efforts, the team head back to Rebel HQ and report to Hilda. But then things take a bizarre turn as the princess beckons a very confused Fury into her bed, and we very nearly get an NES sex scene. I told her to stay off the booze, princess, what even is that stuff? But then it's revealed that this isn't actually Hilda, rather a Lamia queen in disguise, with Furion quickly deciding that, yeah, I'm good thanks. But that brings the question of, where's the actual Princess Hilda? Well, they don't have to wait long for that answer, as it's suddenly announced that the Emperor himself is holding a tournament in Palamisha, with the prize being Hilda herself. The team, along with King Gordon, make their way to Palamisha and finally come face to face with the Emperor himself.
Ha! Boom, baby!
But before they get a chance to try and, I don't know, stab him and put an end to his tyranny, the Emperor unleashes a dreaded behemoth on them. They defeat it no problem, but the Emperor goes against his word and throws him in jail. Who could have seen that coming? Fortunately, with some help from this ninja named Paul, the team escapes and even rescues Hilda along the way. With Hilda rescued, she and Gordon decide it's finally time for some proper action, and makes plans to retake the kingdom of Finn from the Emperor. They set up camp just outside the castle, and before long, the rebel army, and by that I mean Furion, Maria, Guy, Layla, and no one else, storm the castle and defeat the general who was in charge of it, successfully reclaiming Finn from the Empire. So that was a success, but now the rebels' interests are towards Minwu, who hasn't been heard from since leaving to find Ultima. So Gordon and Hilda send a gang off to search for him and the legendary spell. The story pretty much grinds to a halt here, as accessing Ultima requires obtaining a pair of masks and a crystal rod, each with their own separate dungeons. Eventually though, the team has all they need, but just before they can reach the tower where Ultima is kept, their ship is unexpectedly swallowed whole by the massive sea serpent Leviathan. Miraculously, the trio survive and even discover a whole town's worth of people just living inside Leviathan's stomach. I guess these people all live on a diet of Leviathan-swallowed fish. Inside Leviathan, the trio meet the last of the Dragoons, a soldier named Ricard, who is also on a quest for Ultima, which is why he wasn't around when the rest of the Dragoons got poisoned. Ricard agrees to help them out, so the trio escape through Leviathan's mouth, at least I think it's his mouth, I mean there are giant teeth in the last room, and climb to the top of the tower they were trying to get to. At the top, they finally find Minwu, who immediately sacrifices himself by using up all of his energies to open the door. Well, that was depressing, but it does allow the party to finally obtain the legendary spell, Ultima. A spell I used once, wasn't impressed by, and went straight back to punching things. Congratulations, Minwu, your death was in vain. That's not even the worst of it though, as the team emerges to find that the Emperor, for some bizarre reason, has cloaked his castle in a magical tornado, and has used it to obliterate a large number of towns. And this isn't like when he supposedly bombed Altair only for it to still look perfectly fine, no. These towns have been reduced to rubble, you can't visit them anymore. This is the final straw though, as the team summon the baby dragon from that egg they placed in the spring a while back and use it to fly into the tornado? Alright, I can work with that. It's here that you finally face off against the Emperor, the one man responsible for all this bloodshed, who has caused so much chaos and terror throughout the course of the game. The man who is responsible for killing our families. And he dies in a single hit. Wow, he didn't put up much of a challenge at all. But with that, the world is finally safe, and within a matter of seconds, the rebels go straight into a dance. A beautiful end to the game, and oh, come on! Well, looks like there's no rest for the rebels as news comes in that the Dark Knight has taken over as Emperor and is basically trying the whole thing again. Yeah, remember him? It's also revealed that this entire time, the Dark Knight was actually Leon. Who on earth could have possibly seen that coming? I'm not sure why he was working for the Emperor this whole time. Maria theorizes that he was brainwashed by black magic, but it's never actually confirmed. Doesn't matter at that moment though, because the gang find out that Sid was caught in the tornado while it was up and was mortally wounded, so he gives you his airship before dying. With the airship, the gang immediately sets off and storms Palamisha Castle, confronting Leon, who isn't willing to give up his power. But just before the gang get a chance to fight, they're suddenly interrupted by the return of the Emperor? What? But how? But I killed you! Okay, so check this out. We did indeed kill the Emperor, but while he was down in hell, he somehow challenged the devil himself to a duel, and get this, he actually won. He successfully overthrew Satan himself, and now commands the underworld, so is now invading the mortal world. I couldn't make this up if I tried. I beat this guy in a single hit. How did he overthrow Satan? Could I overthrow Satan? Anyway, the Emperor is back and he's not happy with us or Leon taking his throne, so he nukes the whole of Palamisha Castle. Fortunately, Ricard manages to distract him just long enough for the others, plus Leon, to escape on the baby dragon, sadly dying in the process.
No!
At this point, there's nothing else to do but travel to Hell to defeat the Emperor, and with Leon finally broken out of his Dark Knight trance and feeling quite sheepish to boot, he agrees to help out and finally joins back up with the party. Only took about 20 hours. But with no other options, the four are forced to enter Hell to deal with the Emperor once and for all. So yeah, that was certainly a much more ambitious story than Final Fantasy I's, and for the most part, I think it worked. It's clearly an 8-bit story, don't get me wrong, and wouldn't fly if it was released today, but for the time, this is certainly the best NES story I've ever seen. Although it certainly does have its hiccups. The main sour point was probably the quest for Ultima. It goes on for 5 whole dungeons and nothing interesting happens during that time. Well, apart from Leviathan. Doesn't help that Ultima itself is absolutely useless, even at high levels. So much for the legend. The story is also prone to a lot of fetch quests similar to the first game. You collect Mithril, the Goddess Bell, the Sunflame, the 2 Masks, the Crystal Rod, Ultima, all of that, it's all there, but I didn't mind it because unlike the first game, these were all related to the plot and took me closer to my final goal. Final Fantasy II also manages to pull off an unusually bleak and depressing atmosphere. I mean, the sheer number of deaths is certainly a part of that. Scott, Joseph, Minwu, Cid, Ricard, the King of Finn, the Dragoons and their dragons, the list goes on, and none of these are fake-outs. When a character dies, they're dead. Well, except for the Emperor, I guess, but it does make all of it very effective. The part that got me in particular was after Joseph died, which in itself was surprising enough, but then I had to go back and tell his daughter he was dead. And the moment she realised her daddy wasn't ever going to come home, that hit me. That poor girl. You can feel the tone of this game through the overworld theme alone. Final Fantasy I's overworld theme was all cheery and triumphant, made you want to go out and save the world. But this game? Melancholic and sad, but also memorable. The game mostly flows pretty well too, though there are some issues here and there. The game uses this strange keyword system where in order to progress you have to learn specific terms from certain NPCs and then use them on other people to get new information out of them. I didn't mind this too much, but I think it was mainly done to prevent sequence breaking. Unlike the first game, Final Fantasy II has an extremely free open world, so if you wanted to, you could potentially walk long distances and get to areas earlier than intended. You probably won't, since you'll almost certainly run into extremely powerful monsters that'll massacre you, but save scumming is a thing you can do, so I think the keywords were a way of mitigating that. As far as knowing where to go, I didn't have a problem with that for the most part. The only time I felt the game could have been a bit clearer was when it wanted me to use this pendant on a hidden mirror. There were a couple of times I wish it could have given me some proper directions though, specifically with the island of Deist or the Mysidian Cave. I knew what my destination was, but I didn't know exactly where it was located. Doesn't help that this world map moved more slowly than Erosion and doesn't highlight everything, so I had to resort to looking up an online map so I could plot my course properly. That was it for progression hiccups though, everything else was fine. So yeah, the game's story is pretty good. It has its surprises, it flows well, Ultima excluded, and it's memorable. Unfortunately, I can't really say the same thing about the characters, who are still rather thin. They do talk to each other every now and again, so they've got more than the Warriors of Light at least, but considering I spent about 20 hours with these guys, I couldn't really tell you much about Firion, Maria, Leon or Guy other than 1 or 2 traits each. I think Firion is nervous around ladies, considering how flustered he looked when Lamia tried making out with him. Maria is more cautious than the others and doesn't appreciate people trying to hit on her. Leon was manipulated by the Emperor easily enough, so I assume he might be a bit mentally unstable. And as for Guy, all I can say about him is that he has a limited vocabulary and he can speak to beavers. It comes completely out of nowhere and is never elaborated on, nor is it ever referenced again, but it certainly stood out, I'll say that. Oh wait, the beavers were originally supposed to be Moogles. Oh, that makes more sense. Wait, Moogles were a thing as early as this game? Huh, that's interesting. Still, Guy speak beaver. Now I want to say that this gets better with the set of rotating guest characters, Minwu, Joseph, Gordon, Layla and Ricard, all of whom join you temporarily at various points before leaving for their own reasons before Leon finally rejoins at the end of the game. But unfortunately, it really doesn't. Minwu, Joseph and Ricard, they're all willing to sacrifice their lives to stop the Emperor, but otherwise I couldn't tell you anything about them. Layla has it slightly better since she starts out as a pirate leader who attempts to plunder the team and steal their gold. When her men are defeated, she accepts defeat and is fully prepared to die, but when shown mercy, doesn't squander it and makes up for her misdeeds by helping the others out in combat. Not much, but it's something, you know? After that though, she's really just your pirate friend and doesn't have any other moments to her name. But credit where credit is due, they did have something going with Gordon. When you first meet him, he considers himself nothing but an unhelpful coward, feeling too scared to do anything in the wake of the destruction in front of him. However, as soon as the Emperor begins bombing innocent towns, Gordon braves his fear and sets off to obtain the Sunflame, and later, with the help of our main trio, successfully blows up the warship, proving his courage to everyone including himself, and becoming a worthy leader of the rebellion because of it. That is the first example of a character arc in the Final Fantasy series, and while it isn't particularly original, it does stand out. Gordon is probably my favourite character in the game because of it. I wish he was a little more helpful in battle, but we'll get to that later. As for the main villain, the Emperor has shockingly little presence. For all the terrible things he does, you only meet him 4 separate times, all of them extremely brief. But he's still the cause of a huge amount of destruction and misery throughout the game, and that's what defines him more than anything. So while he doesn't have many layers, I still want to beat him, so clearly he's doing something right. And come on, how can you not be impressed by someone who can overthrow the devil? So, now that we've got the narrative covered, let's move on to the gameplay. And unfortunately, this is where things start to get rocky. Now, as far as the battle system goes, Final Fantasy II is basically the same as Final Fantasy I. You still have random encounters and battles work the same way, including the lack of auto-retargeting unfortunately, so I won't spend too long here seeing as I already talked about it in the Final Fantasy I video. The only thing that Final Fantasy II adds is the front and back row mechanic. When a character is in the back row, they can't be hit by physical attacks, only magical ones, at the cost of not being able to hit any enemies at all. Sacrificing attack power for better defense basically. If you have a magic user, put them in the back row. They'll take less damage and will still be able to cast spells efficiently. Physical fighters, however, should stay the hell away from the back row because they can't hit anything at all if they're back there, not even for half damage. The problem with this is that when a character dies, they are automatically placed in the back row once they're revived, and I was never able to get the hang of this. So there were so many fights where I would find that my fighters were in the back row and absolutely useless as a result, seeing as mid-battle road changing wasn't a thing in the NES game. Otherwise everything checks out, and I swear the battles feel a little smoother now too. It could be that they removed those white lines from the battle screen, giving the monsters some room to breathe. Something else Final Fantasy II improves on is the magic system. Gone are those useless spell charges from the first game. In this game, characters have a set amount of magic points, or MP, with each spell costing a certain amount. Until you run out of MP, you're free to cast whatever spell you want as often as you like. And while you do still have to keep an eye on your MP gauge, it is much more manageable than Final Fantasy I's spell charges. Unfortunately, while solving one problem, Final Fantasy II has created another: the inventory. Final Fantasy I's inventory was fine. Items stacked up to 99 and key items had their own dedicated slots. That's not a thing in this game though. Items don't stack here, and you're limited to a measly 32 slots, and key items are not separated. To make things worse, key items can't be thrown out when they've fulfilled their use, meaning they essentially shrink your inventory even further. I don't get this at all. The inventory in the first game was perfectly fine. What made them decide to backtrack? This game introduces a bunch of restorative items that I was yearning for in Final Fantasy I, such as high potions, elixirs, ethers, phoenix downs, the list goes on. But because of this limited inventory, I couldn't take proper advantage of that. Now, I will say that this didn't end up being quite as much of a deal breaker as I was expecting it to, and that's because I was able to rely on magic to get me through the game. I was able to use Cure, Esuna, and Life spells to heal, remove status effects, and revive dead party members, and I always had just enough MP to go around, even in the final dungeon. I'd even go as far to say that I had an easier time keeping my party healthy in this game than I did in the first, because the new magic system is just so much better. And fortunately, this magic system is here to stay for most of the upcoming games. Most. Regardless, this inventory is still a problem. There are workarounds, but it is a problem. Unfortunately though, that is far from the worst problem this game has. If you were to ask me what the 3 key issues with Final Fantasy II are, I would give you these 3 key terms: the growth system, dungeons, and status effects. Shall we start from the top? Final Fantasy II's most defining attribute is its unique growth system. When you start the game up, you might notice that there aren't any classes to choose from, but more importantly, battles don't earn you experience points. That's because Final Fantasy II does not use the traditional level up system. For this game, the developers wanted to create a more realistic method of progression, so growth is entirely based on your actions. If you want to get better at something, you have to keep doing it. To get better at using swords, you have to keep using your swords. To make your spells more powerful, you have to keep casting them. If you want more health, you've got to keep tanking hits. It's all based on the idea that practice makes perfect, and this is why none of your characters have assigned job classes. Your characters can all potentially do anything, and it's your choice as to what you want to make them. You could make Firion a healer, have Maria be a master with swords, and make Guy an all-powerful black mage. Or you could give Firion a spear, make Maria a red mage, and make Guy a bare-fisted HP sponge. The choices are all up to you. It's a very interesting system that has a lot of potential, and in the modern day it has been refined and improved in other series such as Saga or Elder Scrolls. But unfortunately, in this game specifically, it wasn't executed very well. Let me make it clear that I respect the idea of the system, I absolutely do, but Final Fantasy II clearly does not understand balancing. Every skill in this game, whether it's physical or magical, has a set of levels, the skill becoming more effective as the level increases. The problem is that every single level requires 100 uses. That's 100 times swinging your sword, 100 times casting the same spell, and that's just to gain a single level, which is already bad enough, but the max level for every skill is 16. 16! That's 1,600 times using a weapon or a spell, and you have to do this for every single weapon and spell individually, which is just not going to happen naturally. Now, future ports of the game would rebalance the numbers a bit to make starting out a bit easier, but in the Famicom original, getting a skill from level 1 to level 2 takes just as long as getting that same skill from level 15 to level 16, which is just wrong. And you need to do this because spells and physical attacks absolutely suck at lower levels, and that's if they even work at all. And it doesn't stop there because your stats are also based off your actions. If you want more HP, which you do, you need to keep taking damage. If you want more MP, you have to keep using magic, which translates as you having to use spells continuously, even if you don't need them. And since HP is based off damage, that means it's dependent on enemies attacking you, which is something out of your control. What this means is that for you to stand a chance in this game, you have to grind. Now, there is a glitch in the Famicom and Origins version of the game that you can use to increase your skill levels a bit more quickly. Basically, you select what you want to do, confirm, and then immediately cancel, and the game acts like you fully performed the action, allowing you to repeat ad nauseum. This helps a little bit, but it's still a lot of watching your characters go forward and backwards again and again, and while it works okay for physical attacks, it's not as good with spells. In the original release, there wasn't a memory mode for the cursor, so in order to grind spells, you have to continuously fumble through menus looking for every single spell every single time, as opposed to attacking where you can just hold one button down, meaning spells take way longer to grow and are far more tedious as a result, especially as you have to go through this with every spell you want to level up. As a result, I didn't even bother. The only spells I used throughout my playthrough were Cure, Heal, and Life, since they were handy outside of battle. Everything else, such as elemental spells, buffs and debuffs, went unused because I couldn't stomach having to grind them all up. Instead, I focused entirely on physical attacks, continuously getting my bare-handed levels up on all characters because it was so much faster. As a result, Firion, Maria, and Guy were all maxed out in their bare-handed levels very early on, meaning they could kill almost everything in a single hit, including most boss fights. It was absolutely insane just how quickly I was able to take out whole teams of enemies. It was flat out overkill, but considering how deadly these guys can be, I don't feel guilty in the slightest. If I can kill them in one hit, I'm going to kill them in one hit. Dignity be damned. This didn't save me from low HP levels though, and due to the random nature of enemy attacks, this was always quite inconsistent. There were several points throughout the game where Guy had twice as much HP as Firion because he was just getting hit more, and it wasn't until about 2/3 of the way through the game that I realised that there actually was a reliable way of gaining HP. Attacking yourself. That's right, you have to attack yourself to get stronger. Why? Final Fantasy II is by far the grindiest game in the series, and you absolutely need to do this, because the game will mop the floor with you if you don't. For proof of this, just look at the rotating cast. Firion, Maria, and Guy are all present throughout the entire party, but the fourth character slot is continuously changing. These guys all come in at lower levels than the rest of the party and require grinding, but then you realise that since they're just going to leave the party soon anyway, there's no point in grinding them up in the first place. As a result, I didn't bother and just let them do what they could, but considering how much lower in level they were, this usually wasn't much. Still, they weren't all useless, so I may as well rank them from most useful to least. Leon was easily my favourite. He doesn't have any magic, but he does have a passable amount of health and had some great skills with swords and axes. Since I hadn't focused on swords with the rest of my party, I gave Leon both my blood swords, and while he was just okay against normal encounters, he was able to absolutely rip bosses a new one. Ricard comes a close second. His sword skills were just as good as Leon's, meaning he was able to do some okay damage and even take care of some weaker enemies. Layla comes in third. She can dual-wield swords and knives, and while she isn't anywhere near as proficient in them as Leon or Ricard, she could still take out a few of the weaker enemies here and there, which could help with crowd control. She also had some thunder magic, allowing her to at least annoy a few bosses. Minwu comes a close fourth. He has a huge variety of white magic spells at insanely high levels, which the rest of your party won't have at this point in the game. He wasn't brilliant in battle, but very helpful outside of it. Joseph wasn't massively helpful, seeing as he only had level 2 punching to his name, but he did have a good health pool, so at least I didn't have to waste magic reviving him. Finally, scraping the bottom of the barrel was Gordon, because good lord, I had never seen a Final Fantasy character who had nothing going for them quite like this guy. He joins with absolutely no weapon skills, no magic, and an absolutely pitiful health pool. I mean, look at that! I like him enough as a character, but combat-wise? No thanks. If we're talking about combat though, then we're also going to have to talk about the second big problem of this game. The dungeons. On paper, these aren't that different from last time. You travel to a dungeon, fight a boss at the end, usually get teleported out once you finish, and endure random encounters with a range of enemies, such as icicles, flowers, suckers, and Big Bird. The problem is the dungeon design. It feels like the designers got a bit carried away this time around because Final Fantasy II's dungeons are massive. Even the shorter ones usually last around 5 floors, often longer, and that wouldn't be too bad if they weren't also complete labyrinths. You can be sure that I always had an online map on standby because these dungeons love to wind and twist and turn and put you into dead ends. Sometimes a path will lead you on for about 3 floors before revealing it was a dead end the whole time, meaning you have to backtrack all the way, especially if you fall for this stupid trick bridge and diced cave. Ugh. A lot of dungeons were also spammed with these stupid decoy doors. These are placed solely to trip you up, as inside is nothing but an empty room with a guaranteed encounter. And if that wasn't already enough, I swear the encounter rate was doubled for this game, and it's like this for every dungeon. As a result, there's a good chance you'll end up becoming disorientated, making you lost, and also making you run into yet more encounters as a result. And for the cherry on the icing, this is still before save points became a thing in dungeons. So if you die at any point, you're doing the entire thing all over again. Fun. Every dungeon is affected in some way by at least a few of these problems, so none immediately stand out as fun. My favourite dungeon was Leviathan's stomach due to the novelty of the concept, and it not having any horrible moments. But you could argue this doesn't even really count since it only has encounters on 2 floors, both of which are extremely short. So if I had to pick a proper favourite, it'd probably be Cashwan Keep, with the Tornado Castle as a close second. They were both fine, and didn't give me any rage moments. The pick for the worst dungeon, however, has far more contenders. Diced Cavern, Mysidia Cave, and the Colosseum all spring to mind, but the winner of worst would have to go to Mysidia Tower. This place has it all. Decoy doors, dead ends, and frustrating encounters, and to top it all off, it goes on for 9 floors, and has 3 separate boss fights. Oh, goody. But the worst thing of all that this dungeon and a handful of other dungeons do is directly connected to the third big problem of this game. Status effects. Holy Christ, status magic is the absolute bane of my existence in this game. You get a teaser of it early on in the warship with these rats that can stun you on contact. Stunned characters can't move for a certain amount of time, and it is possible for your entire party to become stunned, trapping you into an extremely long battle. But at least stun doesn't kill you, right? Unfortunately, later down the road, you will run into other status effects, such as Stone, Confuse, and Toad, which will kill you if it affects everyone. And since enemies can ambush you, it is entirely possible for an enemy to cast a party-wide Toad spell, instantly giving you game over before you got a chance to do anything. Lovely. Now as for the bosses in this game, well, these guys really depend on how you grew your characters. Seeing as I was grinding out my unarmed level at regular intervals, which is based entirely off your strength and not tied to weapon stats, I was able to absolutely cheese the majority of these fights in just 1 or 2 hits, maybe 3 if they were pushing it. If you aren't going that way, however, these guys can be an absolute nightmare, and I did have a couple that gave me trouble in spite of my grinding, the Adamantois and the Thunder Gigas. These bosses hit like trucks, but more importantly have rock hard defense which reduce my normally 3 or 4 digit rolls to mid double digits. And if you're playing the game entirely as intended with weapons and spells, every boss is like this, whether it be the Lamia Queen, the Sergeant, General Gotus, the Landworm, the list goes on. All these fights can give you absolute hell. Those are all my big problems with the game and are the reasons why I can't in good faith say that I enjoy it. There are times where I can get some satisfaction, especially earlier on, but Final Fantasy II is a game that just gets more and more tedious the longer it goes on, with its tiring dungeons, unfair enemies and continuous need to grind. That's not to say there aren't positives though, namely the presentation. It's still an 8-bit game, don't get me wrong, and there is a blatant asset reusage from the first game. I mean, Firion and Leon are both just retools of Final Fantasy I's warrior sprite and Guy is just a recolored thief. But the monster sprites are all far less squished this time around and as a result are more detailed and more colourful, my favourite being the returning Tiamat. They also added some new animations such as getting knocked back or walking off during the victory theme, even if that does look a little bit funny when someone in the party's dead and everyone's just leaving them behind. And the new running away animation is probably the most pathetically funny animation I've ever seen. Then we have the music, which is great once again. If anything, I like it better than the first game. Dungeons don't get their own personal themes this time around, but the theme that plays during most of them gives a great sense of danger. The Imperial March is extremely imposing, showing you exactly who the bad guys are. And I also like the battle theme way more than the first games. Final Fantasy II is also the first game to have a dedicated boss theme. It doesn't play very often, but when it started in the Behemoth fight, it genuinely made me jump. Final Fantasy II is also the debut of many mainstays to the Final Fantasy series. Chocobos make their debut here, these huge yellow horse birds which I always found really cute. It was the first Final Fantasy to include a character named Cid, something every future game would have. It also introduced a large variety of monsters such as Flans, Marlboros, Bombs, and a Behemoth. As for optional content, nope, nothing here. This game has no side quests whatsoever. It is a straight journey from beginning to end. Even the first game had more going on. The closest thing this game has is a handful of optional boss fights found by opening a handful of booby-trapped chests in the final dungeon. They include General Borghen as a zombie, this thing called Astaroth, the returning Tiamat from Final Fantasy I, and... Satan himself. So you're telling me that since he was overthrown by the Emperor, Satan has just been cowering away inside a treasure chest this whole time? Fair enough, but it turns out that yes, I can indeed defeat Satan. Wish I'd tried that before the Emperor beat me to it, honestly. These guys can all hit quite hard, but they were no match for Leon dual-wielding a pair of blood swords. They were fun though. I liked them. And with that, I think we've covered everything. So let's get into the endgame. The reunited quartet make their way through a jade passage that connects our world to Hell, before reaching the capital of the place itself, Castle Pandemonium. This dungeon is an absolute nightmare due to one thing: these goddamn Krull. These are the absolute worst enemies in the game because they can hit you with instant death on contact without any consequence, and the dungeon absolutely spams them. If they manage to ambush you, which they will at some point, good luck. Eventually though, I made it to the Emperor, who vows to defeat us before transforming into his final form. A giant orange skeleton bust with a staff. Okay. Final boss time. The Emperor can be extremely hard since he is very physically resistant and can do up to 3000 damage in a hit. But he doesn't last too long if you've got a blood sword equipped, and Leon had 2 of them, and with the rest of the gang also being able to hold their own, I came out on top very quickly. You know what? That was actually fun. But with that, the Emperor is finally defeated for real this time. Unless he somehow manages to make his way to heaven and manages to overthrow God. Ahem. With the day finally saved, the quartet return home, with peace finally being restored. Leon sadly feels he cannot truly return to the others after everything he did as the Dark Knight, and leaves to spend some time on his own. Furion allows him to go, but promises him that whenever he's ready, they will welcome him back with open arms. Personally, I like to believe Leon went back to Pandemonium and took up the role of Devil from the now-dead Emperor. Just a thought though. But with that, the day is finally saved, ending Final Fantasy II. So, in case it wasn't obvious, I didn't enjoy this game, and that's a shame because there are elements that I do really like about it. I really like the story, the graphics and music are a step up, and it really improved the magic system, and I did always feel like I was progressing. But unfortunately, the dungeons are all extremely tiring, engines can be borderline unfair with the status effects, and the grade system is just not well thought out, requiring hours upon hours of grinding and stabbing yourself just so you can ensure you can survive. These are flaws that are present throughout the entirety of the game and I just can't get past them. If I had to describe Final Fantasy II in one word, it would be tedious. Now some of the future versions such as Dawn of Souls would play around with the numbers to make it a bit more balanced, as well as adding an extra story quest called Soul of Rebirth, where the dead souls of Minwu, Joseph, Ricard and Scott of all characters have to journey to heaven to stop the Emperor from overthrowing God damn it, you can't take him anywhere, can you? Haven't played that campaign in particular, but I have played the rest of Dawn of Souls, and while it does make things a bit better, it's still tedious and requires a lot of grinding. If you want to play Final Fantasy II, get the Pixel Remaster. I haven't played it for myself, yet. It's only a matter of time. But I hear that version was much more thorough with its rebalancing to the point where you can get through the whole thing without grinding, which sounds absolutely incredible. But honestly, I wouldn't recommend this game unless you're already really into the series and are really curious about it. Certainly don't start with it. And look, I know this game has its fans, and to those of you out there, more power to you. You keep enjoying it, no matter what I say. But to me personally, Final Fantasy II is the low point of the series. It is a very flawed follow-up.